Chapter 14, Talks, Rocks, and Holy Box. East Palace, 337 solar year. "Look, I am worried about him," said the middle-aged female voice with a tone of concern. "Tanya, we both know there is no one more capable of taking care of himself better than Captain Laszlo," replied the older Desmond. Her voice rose louder and louder as she spoke. "I know that. It's just those 3 elves he went off with at Luna's. I have to agree with what Sir Grass said. That it was foolish for him to go off with those elves without even being told why, and today of all days. The talks are starting. From a tactical position it makes little sense to me. That is all I am trying to say. You are right, Tanya, but it still doesn't matter. I guess he takes after his father in that sense," answered the aged diplomat in a calm and cool voice. Tanya, suddenly, returned to her normal collective self at this statement. However, the surprise on her face didn't miss his notice. Desmond continued speaking. "Tanya, what I am about to tell you few outside the royal palace know. You might have even suspected it for a number of years. There were a few rumors after all. But some of them were true. Laszlo is, indeed, the missing Prince of Obel. The one lost and thought dead at sea on that horrible and terrible day Her Majesty used the rune of punishment on those dastardly pirates. She sacrificed herself to save King Lino and the 2 children." He continued as he knew he had her full attention now. "Well, you've seen for yourself firsthand how devastating it is when a true rune like that, is unleashed. Anyways, in all the chaos and mad rush to get away, the maid carrying the young prince got ran into by a crew member, causing her to trip and fall. Needless to say, she dropped the baby, who was still sleeping in his basket, which went overboard. At this same time, the queen unleashed the rune's power. The child's attendant tried to go overboard herself in some desperate rescue attempt. But the crewman, who had run into her, stopped her as all the wood and debris floating on the ocean was on fire and there was smoke everywhere," added Desmond. His voice became hoarser as he told her more. There was no way to find the baby, let alone breathe, with all the smoke billowing around the very damaged royal vessel. The ship had to return to port immediately or risk sinking and thus losing even more. Maybe even the king or the young Princess Flare as well. He paused a moment to let out a sigh. "We sent out more ships to try and find the prince's basket, but it was no good. Everyone had to assume the young prince was dead, but then about 16 years later—" "Wait," interjected Tanya, "I know you were King Lino's personal attendant, but you were still just a boy when these things happened. How did you learn about such personal details? To my knowledge, King Lino never spoke about that tragic day afterwards to nobody. I tried to interview him for a book I was writing once. He flatly refused to give me any details other than that his wife and son had died saving their lives. Did he say something to you?" Desmond's voice was still hoarse. He cleared his throat and resumed telling his story. "About 16 years later, the rune of punishment returned to Obel once more. This time on Sir Laszlo's left hand. We had rescued him and his 3 companions who had been set adrift at sea. For a few years after that, in the days leading up to the war with Kuliak, that young man worked for the king, not knowing of his true origins. In truth, none of us knew it either. Though myself, Setsu, and a few others suspected there was something unusual, but familiar, about the boy, but we never could figure it out. Then one night shortly after Kirel and Laszlo's victory in that brief Kuliak rebellion, which would prove the end of that empire, Sir Laszlo was out in the Obel Gardens and was humming a small tune to himself. Lady Flare and Lord Lino were out as well that evening walking together when they came across Laszlo humming that familiar melody. When they asked him where he had learned it, his only answer was that it was something he had always known since he was a small child. His story went on. It was a song that he had remembered from his dreams. Whenever he was sad or feeling lonely, he would hum the song and it would make him feel better. At this, Flare ran into the palace. She returned moments later with a small wooden box. It was a music chest. When she lifted the lid, the same melody that Laszlo had been humming started to play. King Lino told him that this music box had been in the Encultis family for generations and that only members of the royal family would know its tune, as it was something that was only passed on by parent to child within these palace walls. At that moment, it all became clear to them. Tears started to fall from all three of their eyes. The long-lost Prince of Obble had, indeed, survived and was now home. He concluded at last. Tanya was shocked. So, the rumors she had heard among the Federation's more connected influences were true. She had always thought it was possible, but the odds of it being true. It seemed absurd to her when she did the math to calculate the probability. Perhaps, it was fate after all, she thought to herself. However, she was still waiting for Desmond to answer her earlier question. She was not disappointed. Desmond, himself, became a bit emotional as a few tears rolled down his cheeks. He spoke up roughly, "You're right. I was just a boy, not even on the ship that terrible day the Queen of Obble died. However, you see, my family has served the Obble royal family for generations. The reason why I know what happened is my older sister was the attendant who dropped the young prince overboard to his alleged death. My sister cried for weeks and weeks after the incident. She told them what had happened and they tried to tell her that it wasn't her fault. Even His Majesty, King Lino, didn't blame her, saying it was all those pirates' fault. But none of that could soothe my dear sister's pain and guilt. She ended up taking her own life on the 1-year anniversary of that terrible day. That's why I know what happened." Desmond's voice now suddenly changed, now from one of sadness to one of strength. "That is also why I know Master Laszlo will be okay. I shared this story with you to show you my point that he will be just fine. He is like his father. In that he, yes, does have a way of finding trouble, but he also always finds his way back home again. Since he was a baby, he has always been a fighter and survivor. Sir Laszlo does the impossible time and time again. He used and survived a rune that should have killed him time and time again until he finally beat its curse forever. So many times, before, during, and after the war, I thought it was over for him. Yet, he proved me wrong each time. So yes, it may be foolish for me as an old man to say, but that man has made me into a believer that there is nothing he cannot do or survive. Thus, I have no doubt he'll be back tomorrow as he promised he would be to Princess Alinda and the others. After all he has survived, the request of a few elves is nothing in my opinion," he concluded with a smile on his face. The middle-aged scholar and tactician returned his smile with one of her own, then said, "You're right, he does have a knack for pulling off the impossible. He did seem to make Lady Eleanor's job easier as I recall. He. Just then there was a knock on the door. "I guess it's time to start. Are you ready?" asked the older ambassador. Grabbing a few official-looking parchments from off the table, Tanya nodded her head and the two diplomats proceeded out the door and went off to the meeting hall to begin the trade talks. As Tanya and Desmond were discussing the history of Prince Laszlo, on the other side of East Palace, another intense discussion was going on as Alinda was telling a room full of people about the harrowing ordeals of the last few days. She felt a bit intimidated by so many focused, yet familiar, faces watching her. In this small room were several matching velvet red chairs and sofa. And seated in them were the three knights, Rose, Gress, and Robert. As well as her father Aelin and soon-to-be brother-in-law Marcus Godwin, who had always made Alinda feel awkward with his shifty eyes. Whenever they attended a social function and Godwin was there, Alinda had always felt like he was purposely glancing over at her or her sister in a creepy sort of way that said, "Not only am I watching you, but I can see right through you." Like he was undressing them with his eyes. Yes, it was safe to say, she never liked Godwin. He had always given her the chills, and even now in this room, as she recounted her story, she purposed not to look at him. Rather she kept her gaze focused on her dad, and occasionally turning toward Rose for emotional support. However, even not looking at him, she swore she could still feel Marcus's eyes glaring at her. Following her uncle's advice, she told them everything about how it was not simple bandits, but actually about 24 Nethergate warriors. probably under orders from someone in Nagara to kill Rose and kidnap her. Upon hearing this, Robert stood up, fist in hand, ready to attack something, and anger clearly on his face. However, Aelin silently gestured to him to sit down so his daughter could finish her story. Next, she told them about the poisonous darts and how Rose had sacrificed herself to save the princess, to which both brothers gave her small nudges and smiles of good job, while Elinda continued to retell the order of events. Now she came to Sir Laszlo, and she was careful of what she shared next. For she had still wanted answers from him and had to be careful not to say any more than she had told Rose or her uncle, at least not for the moment. Not getting into too many details, she merely said that Laszlo had unleashed a powerful magical attack that not only defeated the remaining assassins, but that it had helped heal Rose as well. It was some kind of a wind attack, she said in a semi-confident, but remorseful, way. It was just hard to remember so much. I mean, at that point it was a blur. I mean, Rose was hurt, and there was so much blood and death, she said as tears began to fall down her cheeks as she once again had to relive those awful moments for what she hoped was the final time. Her father rose up and walked towards her. She, likewise, stood up, and the two embraced in a father-daughter type hug of comfort that non-verbally told the young princess that he was not going to let anything harm her ever again. After this, Aelin turned to the knight. Where then is this Ambassador Laszlo? I've been wanting to meet him since I first read your letter, Gress. And now it seems, I have even more to thank him for. So, where is he? At this, the three knights now debriefed their commander on this morning's events involving the three elves and how the foreign diplomat had not only seemed to able to speak Elvish, but that he also just went off with them without a second thought. I see, said the commander in a very curious manner, when he had all this new news. He continued, while we'll just have to wait to talk to him upon his return. Everyone in the room remained silent for a few moments. Then, Marcus spoke up in a bit of a haughty tone. What would you have us do about Nagara? Is this war again? I mean, attempting to murder a queen's knight and kidnap a member of the royal family is clearly a treasonous act and a breach of the peace treaty we signed with those fools last year. Now Robert stood up again, the same red-hot anger in his eyes. Godwin is right. Commander Aelin, those fanatical occult-driven bastards have gone too far this time. I say we take our army and march right to their sacred temple this time and show them what a real religious purges are like. Or better yet, have Her Majesty, Queen Elamark, unleash the power of the Sun Rune on that crazy sect and destroy the whole lot of them outright. The nerve of those dogs, daring to lay a single finger on our most beloved princess. Enough, Robert, barked Aelin. I hate them just as much as you do. But I also love Falena more. And I will not pull our people into yet another war with those religious bigots unless I have clear proof of this. Don't look at me like that, Robert. We both know in the last war those Nethergate assassins worked for several different leaders in the Nagara government. They had no single master say other than their desire to inflict as much cruelty as possible. Indeed, pain and suffering are their only true master. That is why we need to know who was commanding them. Was it the Nagarians themselves or some rogue element? No, I will not pull our people into another war until we have more information. With that being said, I do not believe for a moment they just found Elinda and the others on their own. No, they had help. Help from the inside. Rose now spoke up. Wait, you think someone in Falena told them where to find us? Grass now added his 2 cents. It was common knowledge among many in the Senate and even the staff that the talks were being moved to the East Palace between us and the island nations. Not since it became clear that having private negotiations in the royal palace wouldn't be totally possible while Nyoko and his cronies would be snooping around for the monthly weapon inspections. It could have been any one of them who may have tipped them off purposely, or perhaps even accidentally. Your keen observations. I've come to depend on them greatly in these dark days, Gress. Indeed, you have your father's careful mind to see through the lies and uncover that kernel of truth, said Aelin somewhat poetically. Gress bowed his head in respect and thanked him for his kind words. However, Aelin now revealed his plan. Gress, Godwyn, I am putting you two in charge of this mission. Gress, I want you to replace Robert as the escort for Nyoku and his men whenever he is in the palace or anywhere in this country. I want him watched like a hawk. If he even sneezes funny, I want to know about it immediately. Godwyn, your family has many connections in the Senate and with several of the merchants that do business with that country and ours. Sniff around, but, of course, do so quietly. You are a Queen's Knight now and one day will take my job, so you might as well get your feet wet now. Do not fail me on this mission. Following any clue, I don't care where it takes you. I want to know the truth about this plot to kidnap my daughter and make whoever has played any part in it pay for their crimes. I shall do as you command, my lord. Godwyn replied in a respectful nobleman-type voice. Gress, likewise, assured his lord he would investigate this further. With you now free, Robert, I want you and Rose to manage security in this place. I want another detachment of 30 soldiers placed here to help watch things here under your command. You have fought and killed many Nethergate assassins before and lived to tell about it. I won't have your excellent skills being wasted by having you anywhere else right now. Rose, after you have fully recovered from your recent ordeal and are at full strength, I want you to help Robert in any way you can. Also, if I am not mistaken from your letter, Gress, a few soldiers from the island nations also arrived with these diplomats. So Rose, inform them of the tightening security changes, so they can do what they must in order to better protect their own people. Yes, your commandership, she said enthusiastically. Rose loved Aelin like a father figure, but she was always very annoyed whenever his passive and more intellectual side took over at their meetings, but moments like this when he was on fire, giving out orders and actively doing something, made her glad he was the leader of the Queen's Knights. No one could think about a problem and quickly devise a solution like Aelin, and for that reason she deeply respected him. She knew the others did too. Aelin now spoke in a concluding tone. Now that this meeting is done, we have some negotiations to get started with already. Gress, send a servant to inform the two remaining ambassadors we are ready to begin. Then you may join Godwyn and myself for the opening meeting. Rose and Alinda, go and get some rest. I imagine you're still fairly tired after all that has happened to you. Robert returned to Sulfalena. Informed the Queen of all that we have learned today. Tell her, I'll be back to the Sun Palace in 5 days' time to further discuss these things with her. Moreover, get those 30 extra soldiers we talked about and return here as soon as possible to begin our enhanced security. With that the meeting was over. They departed to carry out their orders, but not before they stated their great oath in unison, let our mercy as deep as the fate to us and our authority as powerful as the sun be revealed to the entire world. Later that day, after all the introductions and opening formalities, the meeting was well underway. The official talks had begun and were in full swing between the Federation and the Quendom, or so figured Alinda, who was walking around the small lake by herself. She picked up a few stones and was tossing them over the water, watching them skip 2 or 3 times across the surface before they sank underneath. She had too much on her mind to sleep, and besides she felt something else. She didn't know how to describe it. Was it something like boredom? She wondered to herself. She had seen more danger, had felt more fear, and cried more tears in the past few days than she had known in her whole 18 years of life. But on the other hand, being around Laszlo, she had also felt more alive and even useful for the first time in her life. Was the adrenaline finally wearing off? Is that why she felt this way? The shock of the past few days had made everything seem so heightened and intense, but now things seem safe, boring, and normal again from inside the high protected walls of East Palace. The young princess could not help but have her thoughts shift to the young man with the red bandana. How drastically her safe little world had changed in the brief time since she had first met him. And the funny thing was, she didn't miss her old world. Rather, in a weird sort of way, she missed her new one. The one created after he had shown up. Though unbeknownst to him, Turning her world upside down was something she felt she needed. She had for so long wanted to see the world and the people in it. Instead, however, the world had come rushing to her and it was changing and stretching her out of the safe little world of castles and parties. But here, safe once more, behind the high walls, she missed the excitement somewhat. Or maybe, she missed Laszlo. She didn't know. Maybe, it was both. The beautiful princess still had so many questions about this foreigner from the island nations. She knew so little about him. Then, she had a brilliant idea. Of course, why hadn't she thought of it before? Laszlo wasn't the only one here from the island nations. She could ask Tanya or Desmond. Heck, there was even that sickly pale little man who always had a book with him that followed Tanya around everywhere she went. Even those two soldiers that had accompanied them might know something about their boss Laszlo. She stood up and said to herself, if Father can have Gress and Godwin play detective, why can't I as well? Only her target wouldn't be Nethergate, but the one who had single-handedly defeated dozens of them, that twin sword master from the island nations. Meanwhile, in the main meeting hall, Desmond was giving a small little presentation. He had laid out a very large map of the islands and northern continent upon the table. You see, by opening yourself up for trade with the Island Federation, we can open doors to several countries and new customers for you. You could send your exports to Scarlet Moon, Harmonia, Highland, Conacon, even the Dukedom of Gaian, to name a few. Gress replied, so you would be the middlemen in all this transporting of our wares or theirs back and forth. And what percentage of the sale would you charge us? Plus, what if our merchants wanted to trade with one of those countries you mentioned directly? How would you feel about that? Tanya now interjected. The charge depends on the cargo, size, weight, value, etc., but typically it is a 10 to 15% tariff of the final sale price. As for your second question, you are more than free to trade with whomever you like. It will in no way violate this treaty. We can even help supply you professional shipwrights who can teach your own sailors to build more modern and faster ocean-going vessels than you have now. For a commission's fee, of course. Of course, answered Gress, a little more cynical than he may have intended to sound. Look, we're not here to pressure you, and certainly we are not trying to bully you into anything. But we have been trading with these countries for years. Decades even. We know the good merchants and the bad ones. We know what the prices of things should be, trade-wise. We try very hard to not get taken advantage of by some greedy merchant, and do likewise to ensure we don't take advantage of anyone ourselves. We have built a very reliable and honorable reputation these last 30 years that speaks for itself. As you know, in this business, your good name means everything. We don't just build trade networks. No sir, we build partnerships and friendships with many countries. Why, there is no more trusted friend or business partnership than that between Conacon and the islands. And in that same spirit of friendship and prosperity for both our nations is why we are here today, spoke Desmond in a very sincere cadence. Godwin now spoke up. Very well spoken, Master Desmond, well spoken indeed. But I have a question for you. You said your nation trades with all these other nations. He gestured to the map. Have you opened trade with any other nation on the southern continent besides us? And if you haven't, would you open trade with other nations here? Say for example, the theocracy of Nagara? Surprised by this question, the older man was not sure what was being veiled behind it. Lucky for him, Tanya had not missed the question being asked behind the question. She replied, we have no such trade relationships with any nation on this continent. You would be the first. However, we do reserve the right to trade with whom we will. Also, I want to make this clear, island nations trade law clearly says we stay neutral in any conflict between other nations unless it represents a direct threat to our own national security. With all that being said, the island nations has no immediate desire to trade with the Nagarians. To our knowledge, they have no natural resources we would want. Nor have they ever opened up to us in any way to indicate they would want to trade, let alone even talk. They have always seemed like an isolationist people and very xenophobic. Unlike your fair and kind people, who have been very open and friendly toward us, she concluded with a polite smile. I think that is enough for today, concluded Aelin. 5 hours is enough for the first day. We shall meet again in 3 days at noon. Perhaps, also, we'll be honored to host all of you. He gestured to the third empty chair on the island nation's side of the table. Desmond nodded in agreement. Then, both islanders looked at the empty chair and then back at each other with awkward grins. Suddenly, 2 objects came bursting through the windows. Both were rocks that were wrapped in paper. One of these rocks nearly hit Gress, but thanks to his fast reflexes he dodged the flying debris. The other rock didn't hit anyone and landed on the table, but it was far more dangerous as it was on fire. The paper that had been wrapped around the one rock was set ablaze, suddenly catching the large map that Desmond had laid out on the table early was on fire as well. Water. We need water now, yelled several people in the room. Everyone was looking around, but no one seemed to be able to find any. Then out of nowhere, the sounds and sight of a rune being used filled the room. It was Godwin. He had used a water rune to summon a mist of water vapor. It was a rather simple magic spell, but the aquatic fog did the trick and quickly put out the fire. The guards who were posted outside the door suddenly came running in at the sound of all the commotion inside. They looked to the commander for orders, and he was quick to give them, the north side of the building. Now. We have an intruder. Go, now. They ran out of the room toward the north side of the building as they were told. Everyone ran to the window to try and see the intruder, but it didn't matter as there was now no one there. All they saw were palace guards running into the courtyard and looking around for the would-be saboteur. Gress left the window and went to pick up the rock that had nearly hit him. He removed the piece of paper, read it, and then said, "Your Highness. Look at this." Everyone spun around to see the piece of paper. Aelin took it from his hand and read it aloud. "We will never accept any outsiders. Trade or otherwise. Our quendom must remain pure and free. Long live the true Faelinans." Desmond spoke up. "What does this mean, Commander Aelin?" "It means," spoke up Godwin instead of Aelin, "things have now gotten even more complicated." Aelin had handed the letter back to Gress and had taken the rock from his hand and was now studying it very carefully with great interest to the surprise of most in the room. After a few minutes of turning the rock over and over again on all its sides. Next, Aelin brushed all the wet ashes off the table to find the other rock. After studying it carefully as well, everyone was now on the edge of their seats with interest. In addition, Rose and Alinda had joined them once they had heard what happened and wanted to make sure everyone was okay. At last, he spoke up, "These rocks are not from here. No, our stone thrower brought these rocks with him. He didn't just pick them up when he arrived here." "How do you know this?" Rose asked. "Simple," he replied. "All the rocks in this area are sedimentary-type rocks that were formed by the Faetuous River, but these 2 stones are igneous-type rocks. They weren't made by some body of water. No, they are very old and have been pressed by forces and heat from deep under the earth. There is only one place these rocks could have come from, and that is Mount Amdut." Gress now spoke up, "That's in the middle of the country. Wait, that is Barrows's territory. Do you think the Barrows's clan might be behind this surprise attack?" Aelin said, "I wouldn't rule it out for the moment." Then, he looked up toward his daughter and the 2 ambassadors, and added, "Dear, it's getting late, why don't you take our guests down to dinner? There is nothing more to do here." Taking the hint, Rose escorted Alinda, the 2 diplomats, as well as Daniel and the remaining Marine Knights, who had shown up as well once they learned of the fire attack, into the banquet hall for dinner. Nothing of interest happened for the rest of the day. However, the following evening, when the sun was returning to its twilight dwellings and a few of the brighter evening stars were starting to show forth, Alinda saw Tanya sitting on the bench overlooking the small lake that flickered with all the colors of the sunset on its western side. In spite of all that had happened yesterday, she still wanted to ask some of Laszlo's friends questions about him. She saw a small opened book in the older woman's hands. What are you reading, Miss Tanya? Asked the teenage princess in a small talk, but curious demeanor. Tanya's eye shot up and then back down to her open page. She spoke softly, a history book called The Rise and Fall of the Kuliuk Empire. Oh, that sounds interesting and very educational, replied the young silver-haired woman with a polite accent. It is indeed interesting. And it should be very educational, seeing as how I helped to co-author it. Wow, you wrote it. That's pretty neat, but I bet you've written quite a few books, added Alinda. For the first time, Tanya looked up from her book and now seemed genuinely interested in the conversation with the princess. She said, yes, I have written a few books in my time. Mostly historical, but I have done a few biographies as well. Alinda, realizing she could use the book as a way to move the conversation in the direction she wanted it to go, continued, so, Kuliuk wasn't that the country you defeated before forming the Island Nation Federation? Sir Laszlo said that you and Mr. Desmond had fought in the war. I guess it'd be only natural you would have such a vested interest in it. Now bit more intrigued, Tanya asked, really? Sir Laszlo told you that? What else did he tell you about us? Suddenly, feeling on the defensive, Alinda answered, oh no, I didn't mean it like that. He didn't say a lot. Laszlo had just mentioned it right before he jumped into a river to save that elf boy. Elf boy? Asked the librarian. Oh, that's right, you don't know, responded Alinda, who then proceeded once more to tell Tanya her story of all that had happened to her and Laszlo these past few days involving Nethergate and the elves while they were in Lunas. After she was finished, Tanya spoke up, wow, that's some story. Oh my, this is going to be harder than I thought. First, I just thought some local nobles were against us. This Barrows family that your father mentioned after the incident at the meeting hall. But now these Nethergate assassins and Nagara. It seems like everyone is against this treaty from happening. This is much bigger than I thought. We're undoubtedly going to need Laszlo and his runes help if we're going to. I mean, I just wish we knew when he would be back. I always feel safer when he is around. Finally, seeing the segue she had been waiting for to ask about his rune, she said, yes, I agree with you. With all these people against us, we need him. I mean, I know what you mean. That day in the woods, I was scared to death, but Laszlo just looked at me with those eyes and told me we were going to be all right. There was just something in his voice that even though it seemed impossible, I believed him and he did what he promised. Yeah, he has a knack for pulling off the impossible as well as for inspiring others to do so as well, added Tanya in a reminiscent sort of way. Before Alinda could press her next question about his rune, something odd happened. Suddenly, from the opposite side of the lake the two women saw a strange yellow light as three figures appeared. Then suddenly as they had appeared, two of the figures vanished again instantly in the same yellow light, leaving the one figure there alone. Both women began to run toward the figure knowing exactly who it was instantly. Laszlo heard two female voices yelling in the distance. He recognized both of them at once. It was Tanya and Princess Alinda. Both embraced Laszlo immediately as though they had not seen him in a long time, even though it had hardly been more than a few days. Then he looked more closely at Tanya's face. There was a gladness that to see him again, but there was something else in it that was bothering her as well. What is the matter, Tanya? He asked her. Laszlo, I am afraid we have a problem, she answered. He now looked to Alinda for some kind of confirmation, but now her previous smile at seeing him turned into a frown as she nodded her head in affirmation of Tanya's words. It appears we have more enemies than we thought. Another strange voice called out. A voice Laszlo had never heard before, but one that suddenly sent a chill running up his spine. Oh, and who are you? Asked the ageless warrior. Forgive me, we have not met yet, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Marcus Godwin, I am the betrothed of Her Highness Princess Syra and the next commander of the Queen's Knights here in Falena. It is a pleasure to finally meet the man. I have heard so much about you these past few days. He said this last part with a masked tone of gladness. "It's nice to meet you as well," lied Laszlo, as there was something still unnerving about this man. Turning his gaze back toward the women, he asked, "So what is this news about another problem or enemy, Tanya? What has happened?" Near the southwestern border of Falena, he lay between the living and the dead. The half-moon rune burned deep within the cloned body his twisted soul still occupied. Both rune and spirit were fighting for control of the fleshly vessel. Another vessel wasted, thought Razi. It had been a week since his master had received the powerful and unique rune from that primeval vampire, Necklord. The undead true rune bearer had warned the ancient priest that this half-moon rune, while not as powerful as its true rune parent, the moon rune, shared several of its progenitor's characteristics, such as transforming its host into something that exists between the living and the dead, and then would enslave its host's mind. It had taken Necklord, and before him, Sierra the Coven Mistress, decades to gain control and mastery of the true rune. Yet, his master was now trying to gain control of this dark rune in weeks. As he engaged in a battle of wills against the moon rune's progeny, it was the clone vessels that were the real victims. The dark and corrupted soul of Nyoka typically burned through a clone body in about a month, but since he had gained the half-moon rune, he had burned through 3 bodies this week and was about to probably need a 4th before the sun set on this day. His master, Nyoka, one of the 4 great priests, who reigned over the newly formed nation of Nagara, had been in a near trance-like state since he had embedded the rune in the host body. Stopping only to eat some or use the archaic mystic ritual of transferring his soul and the rune into a new body as the old had dried up like a husk, as these 2 dark and keen magical forces battled for control of the vessel. The young warrior, Razi, wondered how much his master knew had happened this week. He had told him the moment when the few remaining members of Nethergate had returned beaten and empty-handed, but his master seemed to take the news of their failure utterly indifferently. For the old priest's plan of gaining control of the 3 runes of Falena to succeed, he was going to need a member of the Falenan royal family. For it was their blood alone that the 3 solar runes seemed to respond best to. No doubt a spell placed upon the family or the solar runes themselves, by the Sindarians, reasoned Razi one night while he watched his master struggling for control. The original plan was to capture the younger princess, Alinda. Since she was not in line for the throne, the security around her would be light. Apparently, his master was wrong, reasoned the young blonde servant. Not only had a few guards dispatched over 24 of her would-be kidnappers. These Nethergate assassins would need to be replaced as soon as possible, if Nyoka's plan to steal the 3 solar runes of Falena was going to work. Moreover, according to the reports, one of her guards commanded a very powerful rune. No doubt a great magician, reported the few surviving Nethergate warriors. Fortunately, all was not lost for the Nagarian clergy. They still had a trump card. They still had a secret arrangement with Godwin. He was ambitious, cunning, and extremely devious. Under normal circumstances he could not be trusted. But, as long as both men had common interests and plans for the country, they could count on each other to keep their end of the deal. Indeed, their common interests would keep the plan alive for the moment. Then Razi had an epiphany: keep the plan alive. Keep him alive. He said to himself one night. That's it. He knew how he could keep the cloned human shells from being so quickly consumed by the mystical battle of Dark Rune and Darker Soul. He proceeded down deep into the basement of his master's eerie estate. The subterranean room was lined with solid rock from floor to ceiling and all the walls in between. Along the walls were many shelves of old books, potions, and dozens of rune crystals and orbs. Making his way to a shelf that was covered in dusts and cobwebs, clearly it was not used very often. Above the shelf was a sign that had the words Holy Magic written on it. Rummaging around several wooden boxes, Razi at last found what he was looking for in one box, and then he found the other object he was searching for in a box on the shelf below. He had them both now, a shield rune and a resurrection rune. He ran back upstairs. Using the secret Harmonian techniques the old priest had shown him, he constituted one of the clone orbs into a new human body, an empty vessel for his master to indwell. However, instead of this one being consumed by the half-moon rune and his lord's poisonous soul in mere hours, he now hoped his new plan would buy more time for his superior to gain the mastery of the insidiously dark rune. The unique rune that would allow him to command legions of undead forces to serve at his beck and call. In all the world, there are hundreds of types and classes of runes, but all were born from the original all-powerful 27 true runes, such as the rune of punishment, the sun rune, the moon rune and so on. All of them govern the forces guiding this world. Moreover, among the hundreds of children runes that have been spawned, few are as unique and feared by the forces of darkness as much as the shield and resurrection runes were. For both these runes were imbued with powerful holy magic of the light side. While their healing and offensive spells were no more powerful than an elemental rune against a normal foe or beast. However, against the forces of darkness, the undead, zombies, vampires, and alike, these spells had proven to be exceptionally formidable. Contrary to its name, the resurrection rune couldn't bring the dead back to life. However, with its powerful healing and restorative spells, even the ability to revive unconscious allies, alongside its few offensive spells, it was easy to understand how this rune got its name. The shield rune, like its parent rune, the bright shield rune, which was one half of the rune of beginning, another true rune. The shield rune, as its name implies, had very strong defensive magical abilities, able to bolster its user's defensive skills. It even had a few very strong healing spells. Using his above-average rune sage skills, Razi placed the shield rune in the vessel's left hand, and the resurrection rune in its forehead. For he knew the half-moon rune had some will and preference of its own, since it was so powerful, and it would only be able to be embedded in the host's right hand. The young Nagara priest's plan was simple. Since it was the curse of the half-moon rune to turn its host into a creature of the undead, which the magic that created and sustained the empty human vessel couldn't handle nor adapt to, something needed to be done to avert this. The very nature of the resurrection rune, reasoned Razi, should prevent and keep the undead curse from taking over this body so quickly. Moreover, the shield rune should not only defend and protect the host from this unholy curse as well as bolster the effects of the resurrection rune. It might even be able to help subjugate the half-moon's will enough to allow Nyoka's spirit to gain the upper hand in this mystical battle of wills for control and dominance. Completing the ritual just in time, Razi told his master the new body was ready and that he had made a few improvements that may help his battle for control. Nyoka's desolated husk of a vessel started to glow a pale dark color. A substance thicker than fog, but as black as sin, seemed to pour out of the mouth of the now dead vessel and into the new awaiting one. Suddenly the once lifeless new vessel started breathing and its heart began beating. The fingers and toes and other extremities began to twitch and move on their own accord. Moreover, the emblem of the half-moon rune started to glow a dark blue over the empty former shell of Nyoka. Using his skills once more, Razi captured the rune into a new empty orb and then proceeded to embed the rune once more into his master's new shell as he had done 3 times prior. However, this time the rune didn't immediately jump into the host. It resisted, sensing no doubt the 2 holy classes of runes. Not unhindered by this, Razi summoned forth all his magical skills and focus, with which he forced the rune to go into the new host body. At once, the rune started glowing in his right hand. However, the shield and resurrection runes started glowing as well from their respective parts of the body. It soon became clear to the young man. His plan was working to some degree, but what the outcome would be he didn't know. He could see that Nyoka's soul was repulsed by the 2 new runes as well, but he did seem to understand why they were there and didn't hinder their spells from taking effect through the vessel. Different colored lights seemed to be glowing all around the new cloned vessel. The energy being emanated from the body was too intense for Razi, who was thrown back to the wall as waves of power flew off in all directions. Razi started to now have doubts about his plans. He thought the body would be destroyed as the balance of will and power started to shift away from the mighty half-moon rune. Suddenly, the light show ended as quickly as it had started. Most of the furniture and accessories around the room had been knocked over and thrown against the walls as Razi had been. The room looked like a twister had just gone through it, but now it was over. All was quiet. Eerily quiet. Aroused by the sound of silence, Razi stood up to his feet and walked over to the table where his master's new body laid cold and motionless. As the young arrogant man approached the clone shell, he thought his plan to help Nyoka had failed and he now was worse off than he had been before. He now stood over the motionless form wondering what to do next, when unexpectedly, its eyes opened very suddenly. This quick motion of movement took Razi by surprise. He jumped back, his hand at his sword, before he quickly regained his composure at the old cleric's side. Nyoka's eyes opened fully. They were pure white and glossy all over. Soon, however, shades of black spots started to fill in where the iris and pupil should be. Once again, the heart, lungs, and other organs were beating and moving on their own accord. The ancient darkness that called this vessel home at last sat up, fully aware of all his surroundings. He touched his forehead, then the back of his left hand, and finally the back of his right hand. He just stared at the half-moon rune glyph emblazoned on the back of his hand. A sinister smile overcame his face. He started to laugh, a small cold and unworldly mirth. This unsettling laughter sent a chill up Razi's spine, but he didn't care. His plan had worked. With those two holy runes, his lord was able to cheat the curse of the half-moon rune for now. He didn't have to wait years or even decades to gain full control of this unique and powerful rune. Now all its sinister power was his. He could now command legions of corpses, an undead army to war against any country he wanted. These zombies wouldn't need to be paid, fed, trained, or even need to sleep. They wouldn't care if a road is flat or high, the weather hot or cold, and they would not know fear or cowardice. They would only know one thing: perfect obedience to their master. Razi knew his master's intentions for this. So, he asked his lord, "Where are we going to get enough soldiers to fight against the entire Falanen military? There are not that many graves around here." Nyoka stood up and said in his same cold hollow voice, "Do not thou worry. For I knoweth where we shalt start. Best of all shalt be thine undead warriors. Many of them shall be kin of the Falanen soldiers themselves." Mwaha.